I am your host, Jody Cohen, and I am beyond excited to welcome Dr. Stephen Porges, kind of the father of the polyvagal nerve theory. He is a PhD, a distinguished scientist at Indiana University, whereas he is the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium in the Kinsey Institute. He's also a professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina, a professor emeritus at both the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Maryland. He served as president of the Society for Psychological Research and the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and is a former recipient of the National Institute of Mental Health Research Scientist Development Award. He is also the originator of the Polyvagal Theory, a theory that emphasizes the importance of psychological state in the expression of behavioral, mental health, and health problems related to traumatic experiences. Welcome, Dr. Porges. It's such an unbelievable honor to have you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the kind words. I'm pleased to be here today.
Well, I'm excited if you can kind of share how the autonomic state of the nervous system serves as an innervating variable that biases our reactions to others and events. Actually, if you could, before we get into that, could you just kind of give a layman expression of the polyvagal theory for those people who are not familiar with it?
What we'll try to do is keep it within the constraints of the timing of this interview. Because that I could talk for a few days on that. But basically, let's start with really your point, and that is physiological state is that intervening variable between stimulus and response. The way that our autonomic nervous system is functioning, the state that it's in, functionally determines how we react to stimuli in the environment. So that when our autonomic nervous system is in a state of great resilience, then stimuli just kind of bounce off of us. When our autonomic nervous system is in a state that supports fight or flight or defense, then those stimuli result in a hyperreaction, an aggressiveness, or a sense of being hurt. And if our autonomic nervous system is in a state of shutting down, we're dissociated. We don't even recognize what's being said to us. So the physiological state is really what the polyvagal theory focuses on. And it says that we have these different states that evolved through the evolution of vertebrate autonomic nervous systems. So we have more ancient systems, which are basically shutting down systems. We have a newer one, which is a mobilization or could be used for fight flight. But we have this unique mammalian system, which is a social system that says, my goal in life is to co-regulate with another, to feel safe in the arms of another person.
Yeah, and if you could talk about how the autonomic state serves as kind of a neutral platform for those different classes of behavior.
Yeah, well, the different neural platforms are that when we're in this safe state, we have a neural platform that is regulated by a newer, evolutionarily newer vagal pathway, which happens to be linked in the brainstem with the nerves that regulate the facial muscles. So when we smile, and when we can hear people's voices in noisy environments, and when our voices are melodic, we're projecting our physiological state, our vagal regulation of our heart to another person. So we're projecting it in our voice and in our facial expression. And that's how mammals evolved to connect with each other. So they didn't have language, but they had vocalizations. And what they were doing was signaling the other that they're safe to come close to. And we do that all the time. So we intuitively like people who talk in a more melodic way, and we get away from people who functionally yell at us. Either they have a high-pitched anxious voice or a low-pitched dominating voice. Either way, we don't really want to connect with those people. But if the voice is melodic, our nervous system detects that this is safety, and we want to be closer, we want to learn more about that person. And in polyvagal theory, that nervous system detection is called neuroception because it's outside of the realm of cognition. So we automatically like certain types of vocalizations, like a mother's lullaby. The baby doesn't learn that the melodic voice of a mother is calming. The nervous system is prepared to detect melodic voices as calming cues. And if you have a dog or a kitten, you'll talk the same way to them, and their nervous systems will respond in the same way. In fact, all mammals have a frequency band in which social communication of safety is conveyed. And so you can talk, we intuitively talk to our dogs and cats, but serendipitously or fortunately, their frequency band of social communication overlaps with ours.
Can you I should have asked this earlier on, but can you kind of talk about the different branches of the vagus nerve and
Sure.
where they
Yeah.
travel
The
in the body?
vagus, of course, is this enormously large nerve, but we're going to use it as a metaphor because it connects the brainstem with all the organs in the body. And so we have this whole historical notion that the vagus is first a motor nerve going to the organs, but 80% of the fibers are sensory. So it's your surveillance system. It's taking information from your gut, from your heart, and it's sending it to the brainstem, which is then determining whether or not other portals of your brain are open for cognitive processing or attention, or do you have to be hypervigilant and react to the world? So it's a bidirectional system that is connecting the brain with the body. So, but it evolved in an interesting way. It's actually extremely ancient. So virtually all vertebrates have a vagus. The ancient vagus is really, we still have most of it, and it goes primarily to the organs below our diaphragm. So even though it's connected to the organs above, its primary role is to regulate your gut. And we're going to hold it right there because we're going to basically ask this question: how many of your listeners have gut problems?
Yeah, pretty much everyone, even if they don't recognize it.
Right. And if you have a trauma history, where is it going to be manifested? So this comorbidity of irritable bowel syndrome or gastric distress with trauma is really telling you that the vagus going to the organs below the diaphragm is responding in defense. Now, this comes from more ancient vertebrates because under challenge, the vagus was not this protective, calming, loving nerve. It was a nerve that said, reduce metabolic output. You're going to be in trouble. So defecate, get all the food, because digestion is metabolically costly. So defecation was an adaptive way because these early vertebrates had to hold their breath either underwater or whatever they were doing and appear to be dead. So we have this very ancient defense system of immobilization, shutting down. And again, in the world of trauma, people experience this as dissociation or freezing or literally getting out of their body, being disembodied. And so the goal of health is about being re-embodied and feeling that we are part of our body. And that's really getting the vagus out of defense modes. So the ancient vagus uh, originates in the area of the brainstem that's called, I'm going to give you some anatomical names so we can forget them in a moment. It's called the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, but a lot of people now use the term going dorsal when this older vagal pathway is now becomes your prominent response. It means shutting down. So if some clinicians say, hey, you're going dorsal, they're really saying this old vagus is now taking over. So that was the initial first stage of our evolutionary development of an autonomic regulation system. The second stage was the spinal sympathetics, and we know this about mobilization. Now, all these systems are not always defense systems. They can be utilized to support our homeostatic functions. But when used in defense, it's fight flight with the sympathetics, and it's shutting down with that old dorsal vagus. But mammals have this really unique mammalian branch of the vagus in which you can actually watch in embryology as certain cells of origin of the vagus nerve move from the dorsal area, move ventrally to an area that regulates the muscles of the face and head. So now when we have a melodic voice, that's coming actually, our laryngeal control of vocalizations for intonation is actually through a nerve called the recurrent laryngeal nerve, and that's a vagal nerve. So we have parallel vagal regulation of vocalization and our heart. So now when people are talking from their heart, we hear it and we know it. And we say, ah, that person is real. But you're really saying is the intonation of the voice is triggering in your neuroception that that person's physiological state is calm and loving and trusting. So we have these three, but now these systems work in a hierarchical way. This is really, I'm going to use the term, the beauty of the mammalian system, because it means in a hierarchical way, it means that if we can get this newer, loving, trusting system to work, it functionally regulates the others. It puts them in It contains them from going into defense. It lets them do what they're supposed to do, support our health, growth, and restoration. So when we find safe relationships and trust, we often are self-healing under those conditions. And if we think about how we treat our children who get hurt, we want to give them a hug. And what we're doing is creating that safe container so that that newer ventral vagal circuit downregulates their defenses, lets their breathing calm down, lets their metabolic activity, lets them heal. And if you had any form of disease, you'd want that to occur as well. You want the body to do its job and not to fight off people, but to take care of what's going on inside. So the newer mammalian vagal system is what makes life worth everything. So it's our portal for co-regulation, and it really emphasizes that we as a species didn't evolve to be isolates. We evolved to be social creatures that co-regulated. We're not self-regulatory all the time. And those of us who have reasonable co-regulatory options have usually the capacity to self-regulate. And if we get into the world that we're all dropped into, we're basically told that we have to self-regulate. And if we're not good people. And this includes in school systems, they're missing the point. If you don't have the capacity to self-regulate, being told or being demanded to self-regulate, you'll fall apart. You need options of co-regulation to get the system organized sufficiently to get enough resource to be a self-regulator.
Yes. I mean, you've said so many amazing things that I want to unpack, but I really want to land on that last point, especially now we're being overwhelmed with fear messaging, which makes us feel unsafe and we're not allowed to connect. So we're being kind of taken out of our ability to self-regulate, which turns off our nervous or our immune system as
Yeah.
well.
I wrote a paper this past month for a psychiatry journal, which talked about the paradoxical challenge to our nervous system of the pandemic. Number one, we're under threat. The virus is a threat, and we have to acknowledge it. But what happens when our bodies are under threat? We retract our social engagement system with this ventral vagal circuit so that we're more hypervigilant, more concerned about what's going on around us. And our physiology is now more likely to be reactive to those that we interact with, whether it's on social media or the phone. So through the history of humanity, the history of the evolution of being a human, when humans were threatened, how did they mitigate their threat responses? They mitigated it through social interaction, through being hugged, through being with a trusted individual. But we have what we're calling social distancing going on. And the social distancing creates a problem because it takes away from us the toolkit that humanity had always used to regulate threat. So it's problematic. In some of my discussions, I'm learning that people shouldn't use the word social distancing. They should use the word physical distancing so they respect social communication. So even when they're physically distancing, they should kind of wave at people and smile and have an interaction. Instead, what we often see, and I'm going to pick it up right in front of me because I have one right with me, you'll see I do have a mask.
Yeah, you can't see facial expressions.
I'm not going to put it on, but I do
Yeah.
have a mask. And often when people walk by, they drop their heads, they gaze avert. And,
Yes.
and so when you gaze avert to a person, it's a trigger to their nervous system through neuroception. It's a trigger of being dismissed or being rejected. And our bodies interpret these reactions with our own personal narrative. And we start feeling less poor about ourselves, or we may get angry at the person who does it. But we have to understand that our bodies are reacting to these cues. We have to really respect the fact that the virus is a true threat. And we have to understand that we have to maintain a type of social communication. And what I've been really kind of saying, since I now spend so much time on Zoom or Skype,
Yeah,
um,
I know.
and what I decided to do was to treat the moments a little bit differently, because we have been so trained with two-dimensional screens not to think of them as people or moments of interaction. So if
Yeah.
you and I were at a Starbucks, we'd be looking at each other, we'd be talking, and we have a different level of connection. So
Love that.
well, I have mine here too. So I made a decision. I decided I'd start wearing my reading glasses during during webinars so that I could see people's faces more clearly, and I would make an effort to look more directly at them. The problem with I have a 27-inch screen, so I'm looking up when I want to look down at you.
Yeah.
So the camera is really not in the best place, but I am really making it, I would say, I'm retraining myself to do what I would naturally do, and that is to look at people's faces, to pick up the cues in their face, to listen to their voice, and to basically be more present with them in a video chatting format. The problem is that over the years, we basically have bailed out whenever someone goes on a two-dimensional screen. We'll pick up our phone, we'll do something else, and we won't take that moment of feeling that we're present with that person. So I'm really saying that the way of dealing with this during this crisis, since it's going to be with us for a while, is
Yeah.
that we have to, in a sense, take moments like the moment that we have together now and basically say, this is a moment of being present with you.
Well, and you said two things that I think are fascinating. One thing that you said is kind of that the vagus nerve is assessing, all the senses. So sight, sound, smell, everything, and threat.
Let me,
And
let
that's
me,
also how you engage it and put it in the place of
yeah,
safety.
let me clarify.
Okay.
So the vagus is really connected to our visceral organs. Now, it also has impact in terms of taste and gustatory types of signals. But it is related to other things. So like if we lost our vagal control, bodies would be in a more mobilized state, more defensive, and our pupils would dilate, and now we'd be light sensitive. So there's going to be interactions, and the muscles going to our middle ear muscles, they will become loose so that we can pick up low frequency predator. So the senses are changing, but they're not changing necessarily directly through the vagus, but indirectly through the vagus. So the vagus is affecting basically a greater area of regulation in the brainstem that affects our global state. So
Is it a domino effect that the vagus kind of gets more alert, so it triggers these other things to turn
uh,
on?
well, it's a higher, yeah, you could think of it as a domino, but if you thought of it as a neural platform, that you need specific neural platforms to be focused, to be able to listen, to pick up cues, and to, let's say, smells. You want to be in a state where you're not hypervigilant and turning around to enjoy an odor. Um, your body gets triggered into different neural states, and they are great for different classes or domains of behaviors. Sometimes the classes of behaviors are defense oriented so that we can take care of ourselves. But we pay a price for that, and that is when we take care of ourselves in terms of physical threat, we lose the capacity to engage and feel connected with another.
Yes, and that is kind of the pathway back, like what you were saying. That's a
Yeah.
great tip, by the way, everyone who's listening, that when you're on these conference calls, imagine we're both looking at you and smiling right now. So you are engaging. What are some of the other things that you have found in your research that really helps people engage their safety mechanism and their parasympathetic state?
Yeah, well, let me just bring it back a bit. We've been doing research about what's happening during COVID-19. And the underlying hypothesis was that people who have trauma histories will be dealing with the pandemic. It'll be more difficult in terms of depression and PTSD symptoms and worry. And we've been also using, in a sense, a polyvagal metaphor, and that is physiological state is that intervening variable, meaning subjective measures of our autonomic nervous system. Now, interestingly, that in general, people with trauma will have more defensive autonomic state. But if you co-vary out autonomic state from the trauma history, virtually all the variance is gone. So the real issue is, what is your physiological state? So
And
what is
is
your,
that like your vagal tone, your
yeah, it's
resilience?
like
Okay.
it's the physiological state is saying, is my autonomic state responding defensively, or is it well regulated and enables me to feel calm? So we have some questions about salivation in the mouth, palpitations, irritable bowel symptoms. So you start getting a map. and then we have an index of what that means. But in a sense, the reaction to the COVID virus is really dependent upon that subjective physiological state. And we've done other research before the pandemic, like asking questions about trauma histories and sexual function. And interestingly, again, trauma histories don't lead to sexual dysfunction. Trauma histories lead to autonomic state dysregulation that leads to sexual dysfunction or lack of pleasure in sex. So, and even purpose in life follows the same thing. So the gateway is really your physiological state. If your physiological state is more dysregulated, more reactive, more defensive, meaning less vagal regulation in the pro-social and positive way, then purpose in life, depressive symptoms, anxiety, worry about the pandemic, all these things start going together.
So it's kind of the foundational piece that
Yeah.
determines if you're going, it's like the three little pigs, right? Is the big bad wolf going to blow your house down or not? If you're
Right. If you
vagal,
have a good autonomic vagal regulatory system, your house is made of bricks.
yes, yes. I love that is kind of the main point I really want
Yeah.
people to land on,
Yeah.
that you do not have control of anything outside of you, but you have control of your state. And I'm very excited for you to share
Well,
some things.
well, this is an interesting question. Before we emphasize you have control of your state, sometimes your state acts more reflexively. So we don't want to get people to feel that, like, there are many people who have been victimized, let's say
Right.
raped, and their body immobilized, and now they're carrying the shame that they couldn't run and fight when their body went into an adaptive defensive state of immobilization. So we
Thank you.
want to understand this as reflex it in part, but we also have an awareness of our response. And we also have some tools that we can bring in to help enhance that resilience, greater regulation.
Thank you. That was a very important point. You do never go to blame, shame, or guilt. Yes, and
Yeah,
it can always be unraveled. It's like
yeah,
you can turn the Titanic. It takes time, but you can
right.
do it.
We have to be very careful about the causality model. We know that our body is that intervening variable, but the causality of it. So if I'm an anxious person and physiologically defensive, uh, what is my responsibility? And this is really what your question is. My responsibility is, can I learn to downregulate the physiological state that supports anxiety and defense? And what are the tools that are available to me? So we talked initially about co-regulation, but some people project so much anxiety, so much defensiveness that no one wants to go near them. No one wants to give them a hug. Although the person who has in that physiological state of defensiveness, their dream is to be loved and to be hugged. But the cues they're presenting to another is, I'm not going near that. It's too dangerous. So what do we as enlightened, uh, civilized people do?
Yeah.
Well, we have a knowledge of things like breathing. Breathing is a powerful regulator of vagal activity. Why? Because when we exhale, we actually are enabling the vagus, that newer mammalian vagus, to slow our heart. So in a sense, it's going right to the heart's pacemaker. So deep, slow exhalations increase vagal activity, while long inhalations will turn off that vagal activity. So we can, if we wanted to get ourselves worked up, we huff and puff. Go back to your
Yes.
three little pigs and a wolf metaphor. We huff and we puff, and that
Yeah.
turns off the vagus. But if we take a deep breath and exhale slowly, then the vagus comes on. So chanting is also exhaling slowly, but also talking can be exhaling slowly if we enhance or increase the duration of our phrases. So when I get off of this webinar, I'll feel really relaxed because I'm giving long phrases.
Amazing phrases. This is very helpful. Um, can you talk a little bit more, especially if someone, so many people that I know had some kind of trauma in their life, and if they're listening and maybe they were raped or felt like they were victimized in some space, how do people, like, what's a good first step? How can they start to unpack that trauma and build resilience?
Well, the first part is often our reactions to the trauma are functionally disembodiment, uh, adaptive responses. It didn't happen to me, it happened, but I'm not there. So people start losing or becoming numb. They become numb to others, numb to themselves. So part of the real strategy is to have a deep respect and to honor your own body's reaction. So often when people have been in these situations, they're both ashamed of it, and they also carry an implicit blame, and they can't get rid of it. So the part is to develop an honoring of one's own physiological reactions and say, my body did wonderful things for me. I might have been raped, but I'm alive. Why am I alive? Because I didn't fight back. And if I had fought back, I could have been killed. So we start seeing this gratitude of our own reactions, and we start learning that our body can help protect us. The problem is the rest of society has to be enlightened and informed about how the body actually works. Because when another person hears these stories, they said, why don't you fight? And court cases are really, the judicial system is now slowly being informed that lack of fighting doesn't mean consent. And that's part of what people have to start learning, that bodies react, and our body has its own computer where it's making judgments, and its judgments are there to keep us alive. So when you see people who tend to be combative or oppositional, think again about the intentionality and start looking at them with a different light and saying, why are they so scared? Or why is their body so scared? And can we give their body, not their high intellectual world, but their body cues of safety? Can we
Yes.
slow up how we talk to them? Can we give them a little distance? Can we reduce the cues of threat as opposed to increasing cues of threat by being demanding of people who don't have the resilience to self-regulate?
And that's interesting what you were saying. I do talk to my dog in a baby voice, and that definitely helps. I wonder if it's, the resonance of your own calming energy kind of influences their energy.
Well, you see, vocalizations or acoustic energy is energy. Our presence is an energy. It's both our vocal, it's our movements. So it's just a different metaphor. So we are always trying to get into resonance, or at least we should be trying to get into resonance with another. But an underlying cue there is, does the other person feel safe with us? So you're not going to get a resonance, even with a puppy, unless the puppy feels safe with you. And so you understand the titration of your behaviors. You can't approach too rapidly. You have to assure the puppy that you're there to take care of them and not hurt them.
Yes, yes. And I know you're looking into some acoustic devices that can help build vagal resilience. Can you
Yeah.
speak to that a bit?
Yeah. So several years ago, I developed an intervention that's called the Safe and Sound Protocol. And initially it was to deal with kids who had auditory hypersensitivities, like individuals on spectrum, autism spectrum. And it was using basically a computer altered vocal music that emphasized the intonation or modulation. Now, as I said earlier, that this is really a trigger to our nervous system to calm down. But what does that mean neurophysiologically? It means put the vagus back on, let the vagal brake calm us down. So I conducted research, and we showed that it increased the vagal regulation of the heart. It reduced auditory hypersensitivities, and now the work that we're conducting is that it's also reducing tactile hypersensitivities and visual hypersensitivities, and even increasing when people have trauma or they're autistic, they don't like to vary their foods. They want something that they're familiar with. And so we're actually looking at selective eating, and what we're seeing is they're becoming more diverse in their food choices. This system is available. You can go to my webpage, and you can click on Safe and Sound Protocol, and we'll send you to the company that is distributing it. But we're also modifying some of the algorithms so it can be used as an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator. And this will be available shortly. And we're doing clinical trials right now. We have a clinical trial set up with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is the hypermobility syndrome, but it also, those people also have gut problems and anxiety, and we're seeing if it can modulate their pain. And we're doing a study with Parkinson's individuals to see if we can increase the neuroregulation of the facial muscles. So the whole idea of this acoustic vagal nerve stimulator is a lot of disorders, whether we're talking about autism or Ehlers-Danlos or even Parkinson's. We don't know whether the clinical features like a flat face and all of them, in Parkinson's it's really flat, is really part of the disorder, or is it part of the body's response to having the disorder?
Oh my
So,
gosh. Yeah.
so we have to think differently about this, and some of these symptoms may be treatable, whether it's through a implantable or contact vagal nerve stimulator, which are on the ear, or by listening to acoustic music that's designed to trigger the vagal feedback. So this is
Here.
part of what we have to start learning, and not think of comorbidities as being lifelong deficits.
So I wanted to delve deeper because you mentioned autism and kind of some sensory seeking, sensory avoiding behavior. I've heard you say that a lot of the behaviors that that autistic kids experience is really just trying to self-regulate. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I would say that many of the special populations that we could talk about who have aberrant type behaviors, whether it's autism or even addiction, are really valiant attempts of the individual to try to regulate their state. So they're really, in a sense, trying to be, with autistic kids, they're trying to be good kids, but their body is just kind of highly mobilized and they have to move around and ritualize certain behaviors. So we start seeing the unfolding of some behaviors because their physiological state is providing this neural platform for behaviors that are antisocial.
Can you elaborate on that for addiction?
With addiction, think about what an individual is doing. They're trying to regulate their physiological state through either a behavior or through a drug. And how do people, what's the optimal way of regulating your behavior? Through co-regulation, through interacting with another. So even when we mobilize and make face-to-face contact, we either call that dancing or we call that team sports, which we often call people are dancing. We see a team sports or basketball and they're dancing together because they're moving, but their cues are keeping their behaviors of movement, not to hurt each other. So,
It's
which
true.
is really remarkable. So, play for mammals is mobilization with social communication, usually face to face. And if you don't have face to face, with vocalizations.
Interesting. And can you also, I'm curious, you know, you're using a sound device. You talked about the ear. Can you speak to why the ear is kind of a good platform for accessing the vagus nerve?
Well, the ear is an amazing platform for accessing the vagus because there are sensory pathways that go to the external ear, but there are also pathways that go to the trigeminal uh, from the ear that go to through the trigeminal and facial nerve. And those afferents go to an area of the brainstem that regulates the vagus. So it doesn't really matter that much whether you're really on the vagal afferents or on the trigeminal or facial afferents. And even think about the notion where people will kind of massage or suck on something. That's also a inefficient, but an attempt to stimulate that vagal calming mechanism.
So the
So
pacifier, the reason the binky
yeah,
works is because
yeah,
they're activating the vagus
yeah.
nerve?
Well,
Wow.
also think about what people do this. The trigeminal nerve, the afferents of the trigeminal are just below the surface. And when we do this, it goes back into the brainstem, into the area that regulates the vagus, going to our heart and calms us down. And when we do this to our dog or to ourselves at 4 o'clock in the afternoon to calm ourselves down, it's affecting also blood pressure receptors, which are going to the vagus and calming us down. So a lot of the behaviors that we do, ritualized behaviors that we think we're doing to calm ourselves down, are actually neural exercises.
That is amazing. Is there anything else that you want to share that we haven't spoken to yet?
No, I think we're in a point in time in which a better understanding of our neurophysiology starts to map into practices that people for hundreds of years have known worked, or they were intuitive to others, but they actually have a neuroanatomical and neurophysiological substrate. So when people talk about yoga, or they talk about breath, they talk about chanting, or they talk about even ingestive behaviors, or listening to music that make people feel safer and more comfortable. There's a neurophysiology underneath that. And it's not, in a sense, woo woo. It's actually, one can think of it, and one can think of compassion as a neurobiological intervention.
Well, I loved everything you have said. You've shared so many tools that are going to be so helpful during this time period. Thank you so much. Could you just repeat your website for people that might
Sure,
want to write it down?
sure. The website is stephenporges.com.
Wonderful.
That's
Thank
that's
you.
that's with Stephen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This
You're
was
quite welcome.
amazing.
Enjoyed meeting you. Thank you.